Yeah. So I guess what I wanted to ask was, you mentioned all the different sort of organizations and companies you work with, everything from like-minded funders to NGOs and organizations on the ground. So as you work with them through these different projects, could you tell us what success looks like?
Yeah. So I think with each project, it's a different like outcome or level of impact that we're looking at. Through some of the initial grants that I did, to early stage supply chain tools. For them, it was a matter of help supporting them to launch their product,
Hmm.
or to test in 10 factories
Hmm.
and see, is this something that benefits workers? Is it actually helping to make decisions for factory level management? Yeah, and so just giving them more of that product level support. I think with some of the collaboratives, it's more about challenging where these larger pots of money are going to, and making sure there are different kinds of organizations that are not just the usual suspects, not
Right.
just the ones in our networks, but really trying to work to get the people we don't know, the ones who are doing the work on the ground that actually have that field experience, to get that funding to them. So that's something that we're going through a process of, how do we do that? How do we find the people that we don't know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we really look to our partners and our different grantees, and other funders to challenge us. Right now, we're actually building an advisory group for forced labor and human trafficking to try and bring in those outside perspectives, to challenge us and push our thinking, because I think that's something that happens in philanthropy. You work with the people that you know, and
Yeah.
yeah, just there's a lot of that top down almost impact metric setting that happens. And so for us, something that we've evolved to is really looking to our grantees and partners to set what's important to them, what can they expect to see, what would be that meaningful change, and yeah, try to look to them to guide that conversation. So yeah, definitely a shift for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I can imagine that, it can be comfortable and sort of convenient even to continue working with partners that you develop relationships with. But in your sort of mission and the work you're doing, it's important to really look beyond just your um, already established network of partners and find new organizations that are emerging to support them. And I guess one thing I wanted to ask was, I know you operate across many different industries. So for example, if we were to take, the garment industry or any specific industry that you have work in, do you work with firms to kind of understand the sort of business case for some of these interventions that you're supporting, or is it mostly driven by kind of, the social impacts and social kind of targets you set?
Yeah, I think it really, unfortunately, it really depends.
Yeah.
Initially starting out, HU had a focus on different commodities. So looking at gold or looking at palm oil, and has shifted to more of a global architecture,
Hmm.
where now often like with worker agency, looking for different kinds of examples of innovative approaches to worker organizing or transnational organizing, and trying to find those and really see how they could be applicable elsewhere, or just see what really makes that one special, and take those learnings from that.
Hmm.
I can give an example of one of our grants to the Worker Rights Consortium, which started at the end of 2019, has gone through the last year and is continuing this year. But essentially, they were overseeing a new binding mechanism through which they hope to reduce the prevalence of gender-based violence and harassment in garment industry in Lesotho, which employs overwhelmingly, women, in that region. And so that grant covered about 5 factories and about 10,000 workers. And we were just really interested in understanding more about this worker-driven social responsibility model. So methodology that we find particularly interesting given the insufficiency of existing codes of conduct and voluntary commitments to achieve those outcomes for workers.
Yeah.
So kind of akin to the Fair Food Program or Bangladesh Accord, the agreement is signed onto by 3 global apparel brands, a major jeans supplier, and a coalition of leading trade unions and local women's rights NGOs. So through an establishment of an independent monitoring body, unions and worker representatives will continuously monitor the implementation and outcomes of the program. So just an example that we find to have that binding agreement that is, we're really hopeful about and seeing how it works, and would love to be able to take the learnings from that to either other regions or other industries and just see how it works.
So when you say binding agreement, I guess you're referring to, through these different having brands as well as, worker groups and employers, manufacturers, you're sort of creating, a commitment to a program as opposed to finding, other incentives for a company to, promote these programs and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well put and more simple, easy to understand terms.
No, it's complex stuff. I think, I've also had a chance to kind of, learn a lot about this. And I think, in general, when you talk about some of these types of organizations, whether it's WRC or others, they rely on this idea of worker agency through collective bargaining and through more traditional forms of worker voice, which I think have a really important role to play. But then also I think about how the nature of the garment industry or other sort of industries that employ low income workers or are labor intensive, and there's this sort of productivity driven nature where in order to survive you have to be productive. So then when you have that sort of pressure, then I think the way one way to look at it as well is to think about what would drive kind of the business case to create worker agency and to create freedom.
Right, definitely. I think it's in the past, participation of workers and advocating for themselves wasn't welcome. And so different kinds of legal agreements can be interesting in encouraging that. I think this kind of approach that WRC is taking, which this approach to like worker monitoring and binding agreements, it's especially promising given that it provides real mechanisms for outside third-party monitoring, engaging local community-based NGOs, as well as including those legal stipulations for non-compliance. And so it really shifts the responsibility for monitoring and assessing progress away from the brands themselves, and also away from this cottage industry of auditors, which has popped up and is so easily manipulated. So it's a different means for compliance, and
so it's kind of like a response to maybe the failures even of the accountability mechanisms that came before, that were tried before.
And I think it's a really interesting way to further bolster those. And in some cases, I think they do work. And I'm sure you guys have a lot to say about different kinds of employee engagement tools and some of the successes of them. But I think it's just an interesting tool in the tool belt that we're curious to see how it pans out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a case to be made about different approaches depending on the context. And I
Sure.
think, it's clear that there is a need for this type of accountability, um, depending on, who you're talking about in terms of the employer,
Mm.
the company, and so on. So I can totally, understand how something like this could be effective for sure.